Charlie Kirk's death was incomprehensible. But let me tell you, it was as predictable as it was tragic. For those of us who follow the ideological ins and outs of the culture war, we could see this coming from a mile away. We're involved in our second civil war in America. The country is that ideologically divided. There are two visions fighting for the heart and soul and control of the country. And these visions, Marxism and essentially Christianity, have been fighting each other on battlefields all over the world for more than a century. The escalation that we saw with Kirk and what is coming is largely going to be unavoidable. And that's what the subject of this podcast is about. The analysis of Kirk's death has to go beyond the shooter and what rifle he was using, how he gained access, and all those other elements. The real question is, what radicalized a young 20-some-year-old, seemingly all-American kid to shoot a man who is simply defending what has been essentially the moral vision and the standard-held position of the United States throughout most of its history? And that's the question we ultimately have to understand if we're really going to have a grasp on not only what happened to Charlie Kirk, but what the future holds. In a sense, Kirk was killed by equity. You're going to ask now, what is equity? Equity is essentially a modification of Marxism. It's this toxic cocktail of philosophical positions that come from classical Marxism, critical theory, and postmodern philosophy. They all have the same exact message. And that message is that the United States and Western culture is inherently corrupt. Nothing more than a system of power and exploitation where people amass wealth and privilege to advance themselves at the expense of the marginalized in society. And that's an act of genocide that leads to the death of untold millions upon millions upon millions across the world at any given moment. Anybody who defends this system or participates in this system is an individual who causes genocide and must be eliminated by any means necessary in order to preserve humanity. If you think I'm crazy, take a look at history. That message was Marx's classical critique of Western society that people like Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot, amongst others, used to justify the liquidation of over 100 million people who simply found themselves saying, yeah, the right of a person to determine their outcome and have private property, that's an act of genocide. What has happened in America over the last 100 years is that these ideologies have woven their way through American culture and our educational institutions and political systems, starting in about the early 1920s. And generation after generation, they chipped away at the foundations, the ideological foundations of America. It's that classic 60s radicalism where we're going to overthrow government and the man, and it's all about power and it's all about exploitation, and we're going to create a brave new world. Well, most of us partied and most of us enjoyed the luxury that we have here in America. We ignored this and thought it was inconsequential, that it would never make a difference. But there was one other critical factor that happened in this country that opened the door. And that is generations of people began turning away from Christianity and the Judeo-Christian worldview. They were caught by the lure of the promise of equity, saying that everybody had an equal right to express their gender preference, their sexuality, their lifestyle, that everybody should have an equal level of economic success, that we're going to eliminate gender inequality and inequalities for the LGBTQ community, income inequality. We're going to right all of these wrongs. And all the people heard was that you can have your permissive, progressive, utopian existence. And this really became America's secular religion. But what people don't understand is when you walk away from one religion, you need another. You need to replace a system that gives you moral guidance and the ability to order society. And America turned to equity. Equity said that we can reach comprehensive equality for everybody in this country. And in doing so, we can eliminate starvation, we can eliminate poverty, we can eliminate crime, we can eliminate war, we can eliminate every ill that affects humanity. So what happened in Charlie Kirk's case is that the message, as applied to the transgender community, was this: that the transgender community had every right to every gender expression that they desired. They needed complete comprehensive equality to live in whatever gender state they chose without anybody giving 1 ounce of criticism or restriction. That they should be able to access every protected space, every sports activity, and that they should be considered co-equivalent with any other gender expression that we see in America. That anybody who denied them that right didn't understand that they were victimizing them, stigmatizing them, marginalizing them. And the negative effects of that were leading to a level of suicide within the transgender community that was approaching approximately 40%. And simply saying that we believe in binary gender that aligns with 99.5% of humanity was considered an act of genocide on the transgender community. Well, you take a young man who appears to be searching for a new sense of purpose, a new sense of meaning, who himself was in a relationship with a transgender individual who was transitioning from male to female. And all it takes is one. All it takes is one to believe the message that standing up for these traditional principles is a measure of fascism. It's an act of genocide. And in the Marxist tradition, you simply eliminate those people that stand in the way. And that's precisely what he did. Once he's radicalized, once he takes the message, once he says, as is emerging today in his texts and in his conversations, that Charlie Kirk had a form of hatred that could never, ever be reasoned with. Once the pill is swallowed, then it becomes nearly impossible to stop him. Charlie Kirk would have needed presidential levels of security to have prevented that shooter from taking his life. The question is, what does the future hold? Kirk's assassination shows just how deep and divided America is. We're caught in an ideological war, and we don't understand how these wars operate, especially for most conservatives. We've partied away our lives. We've enjoyed America's wealth and this right we think that we have, that we just get to wake up, go to work, come home, and ignore the world around us. We don't understand what's going on and what's happening to our country. You see, because the ideological foundations of a nation never stay fixed over time. They're always up for grabs. We think it's impossible that anything like equity could capture the hearts and minds of half of the country and lead to assassination of a man like Charlie Kirk. But I am here to tell you that's the norm within the world of equity. If you don't believe me, ask the people that survived Stalin's Russia, Mao's China, Pol Pot's Cambodia. They liquidated 100 million souls that stood in the way. Equity's lust for comprehensive quality knows no end. And there's nothing inherently about America that's going to protect it internally and keep it from the same ravages that equity has done to the rest of the world. There are two facts that tell us, number one, there will be more Charlie Kirks, and number two, that the violence and conflict are only going to escalate. And the first is what I just said. Conservatives have no idea what's going on. And more importantly, they simply want to believe that all they have to do is vote for a savior candidate like Trump, and they're free to go home to their lives and ignore the ideological war that rages around them. Nothing changes in America. Nothing prevents Charlie Kirks if conservatives are going to do what they've done for generations, which is to vote and go home to their lives' agendas. The second fact is this: the left has no idea what they're doing. If you're part of the left and you're listening to this, or if you're running in any way sympathetic with the modern Democratic Party, you have no idea the effing Pandora's box that you have opened. And in part, that's because it's been hidden from you. The proponents of equity know it's murderous history, but they don't want to tell you, and they don't want you to know. But if you're going to believe the cultural riz that's wrapped all around this glorious new term, things like transgender rights, equality, tolerance, fairness, anti-racism, critical race theory, if you've fallen in love with that, you've fallen in love with the most murderous ideology the modern world has ever known. And if you're going to continue down this path, you're simply going to add fuel to a fire that will be almost impossible to put out. Once again, I want you to think long and hard about this. A young American kid like my son, considered a man who is simply protecting and promoting the beliefs we've held in America for almost 200 plus years, and murdered him because he felt he was a fascist. That is what murdered Charlie Kirk. Equity will continue to take America by storm. Equity will continue to radicalize. Equity will continue to push people to destroy the system that they feel is responsible for oppression, victimization, and genocide. It's always been that way, and it always will be. And the only thing that stands in its way is you and your desire to pick up your part of an ideological war and defeat the deadliest ideology the modern world has ever known. Peace be unto you for as long as it lasts.